I wonder if you've ever had questions about calling, like what's God calling you to in your life, or does God have a specific calling for you in life? And chances are, if you follow Jesus any length of time at all, you're going to have that question. And you're going to have that question because God is going to call you to specific things. It's clear that God calls us to some broad general things like advancing the gospel, making Him known, fighting and killing sin. There's some clear commands in Scripture, but also sometimes God gives us special assignments, things that He calls you to do that maybe He wouldn't call anyone else to do. So how do you know that? What does that look like? And that's what I love about the story where we find ourselves today. As we're getting ready for the More campaign, we see specifically today we're going to read a little bit more in the backstory of this guy named Abram, and he was again in the family line of Joseph, but Abram, who would eventually become Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, is called of God. And I wanted to look at his call real quick. So if you read with me in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, it says this. It says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those that bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of earth shall be blessed." Now, man, we could spend a lot of time talking about this specific call and how this can speak to us, but also how this can help us in practical application and discerning God's call in our lives. But a couple takeaways. The very first is what I find intriguing about this call, and really every call in Scripture, is God normally calls people to really difficult things that are uncomfortable and that they can't do in their own strength, that they have no ability to do. And here, notice God isn't calling Abram to something easy. God is not calling Abram to something, that he can himself do. Rather, he's calling him to something that will only happen if God does it. And I've heard this said before. I had a professor that told me this. He said, man, always question callings. If your calling is leading you to a higher promotion, a pay raise, an easier life, question those callings. Now, God can call you to that stuff, but just make sure that it's from the Lord and not a distraction. And we see here that God's calling him to really difficult things, but also the big thing that I want to key in on is how important God's sovereignty is in your calling. I think sometimes we discount God's calling in our lives because we think, man, I just can't do that. I don't have the right gifting or skill set, or I'm not smart enough, or I'm not strong enough, or I've never done that before, all these other things. But what's amazing about the call of Abram, what makes it so incredible, is that it's not dependent on Abram. It's dependent on God. And so in the same way that our salvation has nothing to do with us, but everything to do with our great God and his work in the person of Jesus on the cross and through Christ's resurrection, in the exact same way, your call will be sustained by God, not you. Now, you should walk in obedience in it, but God's going to be the one to make that happen. We've said this before, and we'll say it again, that, man, God is the one that sources your salvation, but God's also the one that sources your obedience. So my prayer is that we be obedient to God and his extraordinary call in our life, even if it doesn't make sense, man, even if it seems impossible and difficult. And as we're leading up to this More campaign, that we'd really believe that God has more planned for us than we could ever imagine in our own mind or ever accomplish in our own strength.